Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first session, our very first video lecture of this Comp 2 class. You already know who I am, but let me introduce to you my dialogue partner in this discussion. This is my very, very good friend, colleague, and collaborator, Caleb Dan Gammons.
Hi.
Mr. Gammons is a prolific writer. He has been writing for
Many years.
many years. He's a published author. He is a playwright who has had his work produced and will continue to have more work produced in the future with our Biblical Drama Institute. He is a video game programmer. He is all-around tech wizard and a role-playing game creator and so much more. And so he is going to be a great dialogue partner today as we talk about this first general introduction topic, and you'll see him a lot more in videos to come. Anything else I need to say about you, Caleb?
I'm excited.
Cool. Cool. So, beginning of this class, we start with the very, very basic thing that we will be continuing to think about through this whole class, and that is what are stories? We tend to have a knee-jerk reaction where all of us kind of think we know what stories are. Like if you say the word story, usually you get the point. However, I found that we don't often really think deeply about what is a story. And it gets somewhat difficult sometimes to define exactly what is a story. So, Caleb, what is a story?
Yes. So when you think about stories, and really, why do we read?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Let's start with just asking that. Why do we read stories? What are we trying to get out of them when we pick up these books full of words? We try to find things that we can relate to within those stories. And generally, if you really relate to characters in a particular story, that can really like take you into the moment. It can really like basically like a doorway to open that allows you to be influenced by certain characters and how they are. And so, generally speaking, what stories are collections of events that take place, and they usually stack on top of each other that have a narrative and a goal. And you always start at one place and you'll end up in a completely different place that takes you to that goal. Now, myself, when I think of stories, I like to use examples. So like for me, let's take a look at a character that is something that a lot of people can relate to. And I think a good character that you should think about when you think about stories is the character of Mrs. Brisby from The Rats of Nymph. Mrs. Brisby is a character that was written, and if you've never read The Rats of Nymph, I highly encourage you to do so. It's a very excellent piece of work.
And there's a good film adaptation too, right?
There's a very good film adaptation that is excellent. To it, and I would highly recommend you watching that too if you've never seen it before.
Yeah. You can dig it up probably a number of places
online.
Number
of places. Yeah. But the character of Mrs. Brisby, her husband has died, and she's a single mother. She's got kids that are sometimes a handful. She's out of her league in just about every situation that she finds herself in, and the situation is that the farmer that she lives nearby has a tractor, and the tractor is like going to mow down her home. So she has to like stop the tractor, but it's only going to stop for like 2 or 3 days. So then she has to go on a journey, right? She has to go on a journey, and every situation that she doesn't know how to fight. She doesn't know what she's doing. She's just trying to raise her children. She's trying to keep them safe. She's going on this journey. And as she's doing so, she's learning more about herself. And you as the reader, you as the person in the audience, viewing this story, you connect with that. That's a very relatable scenario that is very prominent in today's time. A lot of single parents feel overwhelmed, and they're constantly faced with situations where they have to protect their children, but sometimes they don't know what they're doing. Like, like they don't know what they're doing. And so they have to overcome those challenges. And so, in stories help us to bridge those gaps. And that, in a lot of ways, explaining like, you take a look at the works of like J.R.R. Tolkien, for instance, where, a lot of his work was influenced from the war that he was in, and World War I, and so, and you see that throughout his work, but the journey of like Bilbo Baggins, and Bilbo's another one of those characters, just like Mrs. Brisby. He's way out of his league. And in many of those cases, he's way out of his league.
Totally out of his league. I mean, sorry. Caleb and I are both huge fans of J.R.R. Tolkien, and if you ever read The Hobbit, that's one of the things that immediately strikes you is like, oh, there's a fire out there. You go check it out, Bilbo. And he's out there, he's finds some trolls, and he's got no idea what to do. He's got no clue.
Exactly. And so, and through those moments, when you really connect with these characters, as I said, it opens doorways to see life from their point of view. And a lot of times, elements from stories do reflect real life, and you are encouraged. You can find hope through literacy. You can find hope through these characters. And in a lot of ways, it helps you understand certain situations that people go through much better than if somebody just tells you, I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah, definitely.
You know?
For sure.
And a lot of times, if you take a look at the Bible, for instance, Jesus used a lot of parables to do a lot of his teaching. Why did he do that instead of just saying, I'm right and you're wrong? Because if he did, a lot of people may not have taken it the right way, or they may not have understood what he was saying. And so the question of what are stories? Stories are a collection of situations that relate to the reader, that we can all understand and go at and follow the journey with these characters. We feel for these characters, we empathize with these characters, and we see how they're overcoming challenges. We see little bits of the author themselves in each one of these characters. Because as they are pouring their life into this, they're coming from their own personal experiences. And so we connect with those experiences, and we understand life from the viewpoint of the author as well through that. And so it's an amazing thing that can be accomplished, and really the benefit of writing, as opposed to other forms of art like film and theater, is that while film and theater have the advantage on the visual, writing really takes you into a world that's just endless, where you don't have to worry about a budget or a number of how many cast members you can have or the number of characters. You can be in any setting that you want, any place that you want, and it's really just wherever the author wants to take you. And that's a magical process. That's a great experience. And so I would say that stories are experiences. They are great experiences that we get to go on, and we're privileged to go on.
Amen.
I don't know if that answered your question or not.
I think it did. I'm just going to pick up some of the things you were saying. Another author who knew Tolkien very well, C.S. Lewis, I think it was, he said, we read to know that we are not alone. And I think that really hit on what you were saying, is that we find characters that we really empathize with, where, like you said, we can relate to directly. Or even if we can't relate to directly, we know someone like that character, or there's some kind of connection we can find. And so these stories, like you said, take us on this journey with the characters, and where we get to learn and grow along with them from those experiences. There's actually a lot of really interesting recent data where people have gone really deep into more of the science aspect, and they've done brain scans and all kinds of stuff, that when people hear a story that's told really well, it has to be told well. It can't be like a poorly told story. But if someone tells a story really, really well, they've done brain scans of people listening to stories told well. And the activity of the brain when they're engaged in one of these really well told stories actually lines up either very similarly or exactly the same to how people who are really experiencing events, what their brains are like. So when you hear a story or you read a story, it is literally from your brain like you are experiencing what's going on in that story.
Yeah.
So I think you just hit right on the nail of what that stories bring you these experiences and these characters, and they widen your horizons. The experiences you may never have experienced what Bilbo,
Exactly.
or even who was the first character you mentioned?
Mrs. Brisby.
Mrs. Brigsby. And that's an interesting one because both of those are interesting because not only are they different characters, like for instance, neither of us are a single mother, but we can still relate to that character. But there's also the fact that neither one of us are a rat or a hobbit, but we relate to those characters nonetheless inside of that. So it's really cool. Cool. To piggyback on that more, I'm going to add a couple of other academic-y type of things. And Caleb, you feel free to jump in at any point inside of this.
Will do.
One thing we academics talk about is the structure of stories. And that is to basically say every single story that has ever been written or ever will be written all have the same basic structure. And what that structure is you have at the very beginning, you are introduced to what we call the story world, or the world of the story. And this doesn't mean that all stories take place in sort of a fantasy or science fiction world, but it does mean that whatever the world, the environment of this particular story, it could be realistic, it could be exactly like our world, or it could be very different from our world. But whatever it is, we are introduced to that world always at the very beginning of a story. And the other thing about it is at the beginning, things are stable in this world. There is some sort of status quo. And I realize, unfortunately, I messed up where the camera, you guys can't see what's going on. Apologies. Cool, we're good now. Things are stable. Things have a status quo. Things are all going in what would be called normal for that world. And this is also where you will meet your main character, who's also called the protagonist. The Mrs. Bigsby, the Bilbo Baggins, that sort of thing. That person at the beginning you're going to meet and get to know who they are. And what's going to happen is some sort of event is going to come in. And this is called the inciting incident. And this is going to shake up that status quo. The world is no longer going to be stable, it's going to be rocked. This is almost like you could imagine, this part right here is like you've got a ball. And the ball is stable. It's stuck, it stays where it is, it's not moving, it's stable. And the inciting incident is like when you kick that ball, and now all of a sudden that ball is in motion. And that's the inciting incident. And for the rest, almost the rest of that story, the ball is going to keep it going. And you can imagine all of the different events of the story, like the ball rolling up a hill. And we call this the rising action. And essentially, what's going to happen is you're going to have those series of events that Caleb was talking about, that you were talking about, Caleb. And basically, things are going to get more and more complicated, yes. Right? All these new experiences, this is where the character, the protagonist, is going to be going on their journey, and they're going to be changing, things are going to happen, and you're going to be going through all this, and things are going to keep getting more and more and more intense as well, until we get to a point that we call the climax. This is the point where all of the conflict suddenly gets resolved. And the ending of the story is essentially ensured at the climax. The climax is the point at which we know whatever is going to happen at the end is going to be inevitable when it is decided. There's no going back after the climax. Things are secured. And then we have a really steep fall, would be the falling action, which is just the immediate aftermath of the climax. Basically just the result of the climax, you hit it and then poof, everything happens that's going to happen. And then we come to what's called the resolution, or the denouement, if you want to be fancy in French. And this is going to end with the story world once again becoming stable, and there's going to be a new status quo at the end of this process. And so every single story you've ever read, you can map this out on it. It all follows the same basic pattern. That's not to say all stories are the same, obviously, because they are all still very different, but they all follow the same basic pattern. Anything to say or add or question, Caleb?
No, I think you're right. If you take a look at a story like, for instance, Romeo and Juliet, which I think,
classic example.
What was the deciding incident of Romeo and Juliet? Well, they couldn't be together.
Exactly.
They tried different ways that they could meet up, and it didn't work out. And what was the climax of that? Well, they kill each other. And now they're faced with this new reality where there's no more Romeo and Juliet because they're both in the grave. And it's very tragic, but this is the new reality that the whole world that they've set up is faced with.
Exactly. You bringing up Romeo and Juliet also brings up another important thing to talk about. Generally speaking, there are two different types of stories. There's comedy and tragedy. These words are different from how we usually think about them today, in that what we're talking about here in terms of just categories of stories, a comedy is not, it doesn't mean that the story is primarily funny. That's not what we mean by comedy. Neither is a tragedy devoid of humor. A comedy can be very sad at times, and a tragedy can be very funny. Because what these words refer to in talking about just basic types of stories relates to the story world and where it is at the beginning and where it is at the end. So in a comedy, that means that you have a story where at the beginning, everything is terrible. The situation of the story world is grim, bleak, everything sucks, everything's terrible. And through the course of the story and the climax to the falling action where you end is that everything is awesome. At the end of the story, everything is great. We have gone from horrible to great. One example of this that you guys might be familiar with is The Hunger Games actually comes to mind. And believe it or not, despite all the violence and the terribleness and the bad stuff that happens, it is technically a comedy because at the beginning of The Hunger Games, world is horrible, government is terrible, they're killing kids every year in this Hunger Games thing, and at the end, no more Hunger Games, government is gone, Katniss has destroyed that government. So there's that. So tragedy is the inverse of that. The beginning, everything is awesome. At the end, everything is terrible. And everything sucks because of what happened in the middle of it. So
I got a question for you, Hollis.
Yeah.
So we've seen a movie before called Memento, which is basically in reverse.
Yeah.
So how does that fit on this spectrum?
Well, it still fits because even if a story doesn't tell you what happened in chronological order, if you pull it apart and you realign the events in the chronological order, it will still fit this pattern.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Good
the telling of the story does not need to be in chronological order, but when you piece it together into chronological order, you'll figure this out. Now, of course, Memento is kind of notorious for being really, I think people have a bunch of different theories on like what is the actual order, that movie takes place in, and so like probably your definition of whether it's a comedy or a tragedy is going to depend upon,
And for the context of our audience who may have not seen Memento before, Memento is a story where it's very hard to watch because it's told backwards. And so the entire movie starts with the ending scene and it begins with the first scene. And so it's very weird, but it's like every 15 seconds it jumps back 30 seconds. Yeah, exactly. And so
it's a really crazy, bizarre movie. But it's made more difficult because your protagonist is suffering from a memory issue where he actually doesn't form any new memories. So I think it's also trying to kind of make you feel like what he feels like going through life, not forming any new memories. So like every 30 seconds or so, he, doesn't know where he is, or what's going on. So that's all very important and interesting. So that is basically what stories boil down to in terms of the plots. Now, comedy and tragedy are the two biggest types of stories. But if you actually break down, we're not going to go this complex in this class, but if you want to research it, you can. There are also lots of other types of archetypal or master plots that exist in the world that stories fall into. One of the most prominent is called the hero's journey, which was first mapped out by a person named Joseph Campbell. And he talks about, it's very complex. I think he's got there are 40 different steps of the hero's journey that goes through. But most Hollywood movies especially follow that hero's journey really closely. There are other stories like Boy Meets Girl is a very typical one, which basically every romance ever written follows the pattern. Or another fun one, Boy Loses Girl, which a lot of country music songs, for instance, follow that one. There are things like trickster stories or the trickster tricked, which is another big one. And you can get into all of those if you want to. We're not going to go that deep into this class. But this is basically where it goes and what happens. Anything to add, Caleb, to this thing?
No, I think you pretty much hit on all the highlights. The stories, we tell stories all the time. We, if you've ever had a life experience, you have a story to tell. And, it follows the same basic pattern. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. The beginning, everything's new. Everything is fresh. And when you're reading a book for the first time, when you're reading a new book for the first time, there's a magic to opening up the first page and seeing what the first page has on it, because that really tells you if you're going to be able to connect with this book or not, and then when you get to about the middle of the book, that's when you're seasoned into the story. And you really begin to, the characters by this point, the laws, the logic of how this world works. And so, you see patterns within the story. And when you reach the climax at the end of the third act, by this point, it's like we've reached this highest point that this story is going to go. And so after this, everything's going to start. We're ready for this final conflict, and then we're ready for the resolution. And so every single book that you ever read has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And every one of those things is an important. If you read the beginning of a book and the ending of a book, then you're not going to get the big picture. And I think that's what all stories are trying to help you achieve, is to understand the whole entirety of the picture of what's going on with these characters. And so what I really like this diagram that you've written, Hollis, because it really does do a good job of explaining the those things.
Thank you, Caleb. I will ask one thing. You mentioned Act 3 in there. Can you break down what an act is and what you're talking about? Remember, we're dealing with brand new students here.
Okay. So acts. What is an act? An act is like, you know how I mentioned previously about how a story is basically a collection of different situations that stack upon each other. Well, an act is taking a section of those situations that are in order and placing them into basically Act 1 is the beginning, Act 2 is the middle, and Act 3 is the end. We can view it like that. And so the first act is going to deal with setting everything up. And it's basically there to set everything up, and it's sectioned out. It's a way that we can section out a certain portion of the text to be able to help us to better organize our thoughts and organize the story in question. When we reach Act 2 in the middle, we've learned everything that we need to know: the characters' names, the world that we're in, the environment, and what's going on that set up the story. Generally, Act 1 will end with the inciting incident that takes place, where we've established everything that we need to know for the inciting incident to take place, which then plunges into the journey. And I would call Act 2 the journey, because this is the time in which your characters are going to undergo their growth and their struggle, and they're getting ready. It's like in a Batman movie. If you take a look at a Batman movie, which I know Hollis is a major fan, so I'll use that as an example. So in the beginning, we already know who Batman is, but they're going to introduce us to Batman, and they're probably going to introduce you to the main villain as well, because, you know, in the first act, what has the main villain done to incite there being a need in Gotham for Batman to come? In the second act of Batman, what you're going to see is Batman has to undergo something. Like there's going to be a back and forth between him and this villain, and there's going to be a lot of like him finding out things and having to do some research. Maybe he has to go to a facility and find stuff, you know. And so he learns. Act 2 is all about learning. What needs to where we're having to go and what our main objective is. When we reach Act 3, we've been through the journey, we've been through the inciting incident. When we reach Act 3, we're here. We are at the climax, because Act 3 is, okay, we've established everything that we need to know, and now we're ready for the final conflict between Batman and the Joker. You know, we are ready to, we know the place, we know where the Joker's going to be, we've planned out our movements, now it's time to see this in action. So Act 3, we go through, and I think the climax is a good word to use there, actually, Hollis, for Act 3, is the climax and the resolution that takes place afterwards, because, you know, and that's really how, the wrap-up. That's a good word for it, the wrap-up. So we have the beginning, the journey, and the wrap-up. Where each section helps you to be able to organize the stories into an act.
There you go. Cool. That was a great breakdown, Caleb.
Thank you.
Good job. No, that was awesome. That was better than I think I could. So, good. One other thing I want to hit on with that too is transitioning now from the structure and all of that. From the structure, from everything in the story, the characters, the location, the events, the climax, falling action, everything. What is eventually going to emerge from every single story is a message. Now, this message may be profound, or it might not be profound. It's like not every story is necessarily going to give you some kind of life-changing message. But nonetheless, every story is going to give you some kind of message that it's going to say about reality, about the world, about human nature, about relationships, about God or the gods, depending on what kind of culture you're living in. And how you get this message is through experiencing this whole story. And like Caleb was talking about, going on the journey with the protagonist through everything that happens and where you get to, especially when you get to the resolution at the end, the stability. So these messages, like I said, they can be incredibly profound, and what I hope is that the literature that you read in this class, you will find, is usually giving you some kind of profound message about one of those things, something that matters about life. But even stories that are more frivolous, for instance, Saturday morning cartoons or something like that. Aesop's Fables. They're still giving you a message of some kind, even if it's something as simple as don't bet on the rabbit, or something like in the tortoise and the hare, or something like that. Even if it's something as simple as don't lie, or something like that. It's still giving you some kind of message.
And again, it's an easier to explain that through a story than it is through a debate. Because, if you can debate and you can share all the facts about a particular subject till you're blue in the face, that doesn't mean that the person's opinion across the room is going to change.
Exactly.
But if you took it in the form of a story and you did it as an act 1, act 2, and 3, and that other person actually connects with the character in there and sees part of maybe themselves in there, or maybe can relate to it from their own personal experience of what they're going through in the moment, then by connecting with this character, seeing what has happened to them in the same scenario, they are much more, it's like a doorway. Like I said before, it's a doorway where they can be influenced by that and say, oh, well, I see the negative effects of this now. I didn't realize that this is what people went through in this situation. And so storytelling is I don't want to use the word better, but it's definitely a much clearer way of being able to explain your point.
Yeah. That makes total sense, Caleb. And that, I think, is a good point for those of you who are watching this and maybe thinking, well, I'm not an English major. I'm not trying to be an author. I'm not trying to do anything with any of this stuff. So why does it matter to me? And what I would say to you is just like Caleb said, this class, Comp 2, is about stories, but it's also about communication. And it's about how do we effectively communicate with other people. And the reason why stories are the focus of this second, more advanced class is because stories, I'm going to argue, and you'll see, like Caleb was saying, are one of the most effective ways to communicate a message to another person. So this is why more and more, when people talk in public, when they give speeches, if you take a public speaking class, which you will have to, it's a core curriculum class, taught by Professor Parsons, who is a very good teacher, she'll tell you stories are really important to use in public speaking. Stories about something that happened to you or something that happened to your neighbor or your best friend or something like that, because they are so much better at communicating your message than just saying, here's my point 1, point 2, point 3. This is why you should do all this. Story is much more effective in a lot of ways than just giving a point 1, point 2, point 3 thing.
Oh, yeah.
Cool.
Oh, yeah.
So, anything to add for this first lecture, Caleb? That's about all I've got.
I'm gonna put this out there, Hollis. A lot of people say when they go into a writing class or when they start thinking about writing, well, I can't write. I have no talent at writing. And I would say that's false. Yep. That is the most inaccurate statement I've ever heard. And I've heard a lot of people say it, and that is just false.
Agreed.
Every person has a story to tell. And the reason why I say that is, you may struggle at first with coming up with ideas. You may struggle at first with writing dialogue. You can struggle with those things, but everybody's had to struggle with those things.
Exactly.
Hollis has had to struggle with those things. I've had to struggle with those things. There is no writer that's ever, even J.R.R. Tolkien.
Oh, yeah.
Even he struggled. Even the legend J.R.R. Tolkien struggled with at one time in his life with learning how to English.
Exactly.
And so the question isn't, can I write? The question is, what do I write? Because every person has their own style of writing and every person has their own way. You can give 10 different people in a room the same topic and you're going to come back with 10 different stories. Why? Because every single person is different. They think different, and so they approach the problem differently. They approach the inciting incident differently. And so, what I would suggest to you is if you are interested in writing, to start small, start by writing maybe some short stories, and also a trick that really helped me when I very first started writing. And I don't know if they teach this anymore in college, or in schools. Hollis can correct me if I'm wrong, but he probably has heard of this before. You sit down and you write a series of maybe 10, 15 questions that you want to interview your character with. So you come up with a character, say, let's come up with a character right now, Joanne.
Okay.
Joanne Marthers. Okay, so we're gonna interview Joanne Marthers. Okay, Joanne, I need to know your favorite color, what your favorite food is, and you go down the list. And then you, as the person who is the writer, then sits down and thinks like Joanne Marthers. What does she want? What is her favorite color? It's red. What is her favorite food? It's pizza. What is her favorite? What does she do for a living? She's an accountant. And you just write down those situations, and then maybe write out some things like, how does Joanne feel about the government? And then you try to explain from Joanne's perspective, your character's perspective, how this character feels, and try to really get into the character, because I think that will really help you. And do that before you sit down to write your short story, because I think that will really help you when you're first starting out.
Agreed.
But don't ever believe that you can't write stories, because every person can write a story. It's just a matter of what you will bring into this world.
That's awesome. And that's great advice, Caleb, because you all will actually be writing a story in this class. So that's really great to have another author in here to give you guys some advice at the front end. Cool. Well, we will pause this lecture now, but you guys have another lecture video to watch, so don't neglect that. We're going to take a brief break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about one particular example of a story, which is the story of the prodigal son. So make sure you tune back in for that, and we will see you in a moment.